If we're ready to go with the webinar. So I'll just go ahead then. Good afternoon, good morning, good day, depending on where you are listening to this webinar. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the webinar entitled EU and Canada, a like-minded partnership on the circular economy. My name is Colette van der Ven, and I'm the founding director of Tulip Consulting, a Geneva-based consulting firm focused on sustainable trade and development practices. And I'm very happy to be moderating this session today. So this webinar is organized in the frame of a project funded by the European Union's foreign policy instruments and implemented by GOPA. The project seeks to contribute to expanding economic opportunities for EU businesses in Canada in terms of both trade and investment through an effective implementation of CETA. Today, we are zooming in on a particular part of the EU-Canada partnership and focus on how it relates to a transition to a circular economy, both in Canada and in the EU. As we will hear from some of the speakers today, a transition towards a circular economy is increasingly urgent. Current levels of consumption, resource extraction, and processing are responsible for over 90% of global biodiversity loss and water stress, and about half of the greenhouse gas emissions from the global economy. Global material use is predicted to more than double between 2015 and 2060, with potential catastrophic consequences for the planet. A transition towards a circular economy that focuses on sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, redesigning, recycling is thus ever more urgent. Circularity and the transition towards a circular economy stands high on the agenda in both Canada and the EU. The EU has adopted the Circular Economy Action Plan and a variety of related measures, and Canada also has in place a large number of circular economy related initiatives that we'll be seeing across the course of some of these presentations. CETA also plays an important role because trade can foster sustainable value chains and trade in circular economy goods and services. So against this backdrop, this webinar will facilitate an open exchange and sharing of experiences and best practices from the speakers in the context of the circular economy to identify common policy approaches and ways in which the collaboration between EU and Canada can be strengthened within the framework of CETA. Before going into the substance, I would also like to walk you through some of the etiquette and housekeeping rules. Please note first and foremost that this webinar is recorded. You already probably got the screen that made you accept that. Please turn off your microphone. This is optional, but choose the setting active speaker view for a better meeting experience. It's on the top right of your screen. And then after we've gone through the speakers, there will be a question and answer. If you have a question, please type your question in the chat and we'll be monitoring it accordingly. And also to facilitate knowing who is asking the question, please name yourself with your name, last organization, and sorry, your name, your last name and organization as well. I think there's the next slide with the agenda, please. So we'll be following the following agenda. We'll first start with welcoming notes by Matthias Jorgensen, head of the unit of DG Trade USA in Canada, followed by the overview of a circular economy by Ulrich Welch, who I'll be introducing accordingly. Then we will turn from the EU side to the Canadian side, and we'll have Nathalie Thériault talking about circular economy initiatives in Canada. We're going back to the EU after that with Andrew Murphy talking about what's happening at the EU level. And then we'll have some concrete examples on the ground by Laurie Giraud and Barry Friesen, and project team and Barry Friesen from Clean Farms to identify some concrete examples on plastic waste in Canada. Then we have a video with the successes of EU circular economy experts to Canada, followed by a Q&A. And then there will be a summary of the discussion and takeaways, followed by closing remarks from Ulrich Well. Thank you very much. I apologize. I would like now to welcome our first speaker, Matthias Jorgensen, from the head of unit DG Trade for the USA and Canada. I'm very happy to have you with us, Matthias. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Colette, and good afternoon and good morning to all participants on either side of the Atlantic. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. It's a real pleasure for me to give these opening remarks. As Colette said, I'm in charge of working with the US and with Canada, and in relation to Canada, it's really a great job. CETA is a very good agreement, and the implementation is going from strength to strength. The webinar, I think, is a really good opportunity to showcase the very important part of this cooperation that we have with Canada. The whole issue of the circular economy, sustainable development is central to CETA, and it's very topical because this webinar is actually taking place during what is EU Green Week 2023, which is the biggest annual event on environmental policy. And the webinar is organized in the framework of a project funded by the EU Partnership Instrument, which is the instrument that we have to encourage and develop our relations with countries such as Canada. So I looked at the program. It's really exciting. There's going to be a lot of experts in the circular economy, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I like to frame just a little bit the discussion to see why this is a really good fit for CETA. CETA is something that makes it easier for us to trade and invest with Canada. It's basically safer, easier, and greener. And if we now look at, after 5 years of application of the agreement, we have a solid proof that the agreement with Canada is working very well to achieve these objectives. First of all, that's a key point, is that EU-Canada trade has increased very significantly since CETA was provisionally applied around 5 years ago. Bilateral two-way trade in goods has increased by 66% over the past 5 years, reaching a total of 77 billion euros in 2022. And that's a great result. And we have seen also, if you compare this trade relationship with other trade relationships, you can see that this has weathered very well the disruptions that we had due to COVID and has rebounded very strongly. So for us, CETA is really helping us to develop our relations with Canada in general, and it helps us to address and to take on global challenges like the climate, the fight against the climate crisis. That's important, and it builds upon the increasing convergence that we have between the EU and Canada on how to address climate change. We're both committed to working towards a decarbonization of our economies in order to achieve the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. And we are very, both sides, we're very focused on trying to increase the trade in environmental goods and services. And if we look at it again, looking at the statistics, the story is good there. CETA, or since CETA has been applied, EU bilateral trade in environmental goods has increased by nearly a third. And we are also engaged in, and we have organized a number of activities around CETA, for example, in the form of clean tech workshops, to further develop business exchanges between clean tech companies on both sides of the Atlantic, and therefore also do something which is not only good for trade and investment, but also for climate change. This is just some headline news or headlines on this. Ulrich will explain much more in detail how we are trying to use the FTA to advance our trade and sustainable development policy and collaboration with Canada on through CETA. So maybe just one point that I wanted to take up with and mention, in addition to, or maybe a bit outside what Ulrich is going to talk about, is that we have a bilateral dialogue on raw materials under CETA, and which is being promoted to a strategic partnership. That's very important because it reflects the fact that through CETA we have a living agreement, and it's not something that stopped at the moment of negotiation. It's not something that stopped at the moment of ratification. It's something that we are continuously trying to adapt. And the green transition is now key for the EU, as you know, and that green transition will not be possible without the raw materials that allow for innovation and the necessary technological transformation of our industries. And that, again, here the relationship with Canada is really crucial for us. You know that we have gone through a couple of supply chain shocks, and so has Canada in recent years. But Canada is for us a solid, trusted source of supply of raw materials that are critical for the green transition. And Canada produces 15 of the 13 minerals that we have put on our list of critical raw materials. And as you know, Canada is the only country in the Western Hemisphere with all the raw materials required for a lithium ion battery. So Canada is really important for us, and we want to be important for Canada in their green transition. So the idea is not just to use Canada as a purveyor of raw materials. It's also to grow the business opportunities, to grow the value chains that we both will benefit from. And I think this some of the areas, it's a key area, and we're going to continue working on that. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to open the meeting, and I wish you a very good webinar. I think it's really an exciting issue, and we hope that you will come up with some interesting ideas that we can use in what our goal is, which is to constantly try to enrich and improve the implementation of the agreement. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Matthias, for those really interesting introductory remarks that really contextualize, I think, the webinar and what the opportunities are for Canada and the EU to further collaborate in the context of CETA on greening trade, raw material access and security, but also going beyond that by creating investment and trade opportunities, both for Canada and the EU. I'm happy to now give the floor to Ulrich Weil, who will also be speaking from the EU side. Ulrich is heading the Bilateral Trade and Sustainable Development Unit in the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade, and he will be speaking on trade and sustainable development chapters with a focus on trade and sustainable development in the CETA context. Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Colette, and for this very kind introduction. And indeed, you say it, our focus is on trade and sustainable development in bilateral relations. That means in negotiating and implementing EU trade agreements. But we also have under our wings the EU preference systems for the poorer countries of this world. And in the same sense in which Matthias ended, I would like to take that theme further to more detail on the sustainability side, but also show how this contributes to what we call this is a living agreement and how developments that we see on the Canadian side, developments, and that is what I'm talking about, on the EU side, then come to our conversation and help us develop our cooperation. Now, what I talk here about in particular is a policy document that the EU Commission adopted in June last year. So we're about 1 year onwards. It's called the Power of Trade Partnerships for Green and Just Economic Growth. And what it is it is a policy orientation for how the Commission proposes that the European Union is bringing sustainability into the trade agreements that we negotiate, that are ready for ratification, or that we do already have in place, that have entered provisionally or fully into force, like CETA. Next slide, please. Now, the context in which we are is also the one that Matthias referred to, an increased awareness of the need to keep our economies open, to diversify, to foster and develop the trade relationships that we have, that we want to create. And for that, to see the trade agreements as a platform, as a way to for supporting the economy, to diversify supplies, to diversify markets, but also, and as much as on the economic side, as a platform to engage on sustainability topics, notably on the labor questions and on the environment and climate questions. We see this in many situations, that without those agreements, we would not have the same kind of conversations, the same opening and access to governments and for interaction as we have with having those platforms in place. We also see, because of that engagement, that indeed we can come to a different quality of understanding what the opportunities, but in some cases also the challenges are that our partners are confronting. On the labor side, around labor unions, child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination in the workplace, and recently also occupational safety and health. And on the environmental climate side, the multilateral environmental agreements, and notably those who address the key topics for humanities of these times, climate change and biodiversity and circularity, circular economy, as speaker said before, we have a key contribution to make here. Now, in our communication, and that is EU-specific context, in our communication, we have to deal, and we are addressing quite diverse demands that have been brought to the European Commission, to DG Trade. On the one hand, to remain able to conclude agreements for the purposes for which we want to have them, economic and as platforms for sustainability, but also to make them more effective in pursuing the goals that they pursue. And the key question that was there as a topic that captured many minds in the public conversation is the question: would the EU now also introduce trade remedies as part of the toolbox to implement and enforce the commitments we have on sustainability in our trade agreements, like Canada does? Or would the EU continue focusing on purely on the cooperative engagement? Now, the conclusion we had that for agreements, for commitments that seek that deep societal change that's linked to sustainability topics, cooperation is a must-have. We will not achieve anything without the buy-in, the cooperation, the working with our trading partners. But there may be situations at the very end when change is impossible, when there's resistance, where indeed the possibility to resort to trade remedies may help to create the necessary dynamic and leverages. Next slide, please. Very specifically, the TSD review has aimed to come out with concrete actions which are centered around these 6 policy areas that we display here on the slide. We have around these 6 topics, we have 20 actions. I won't take you through all of those. That might be a bit too much. But what we would normally do in countries where we have, for example, gaps in compliance with international labor standards, or questions about engaging them in multilateral work on, for example, the future agreement on plastics, that would be a platform for which we can use the agreement. Important to say, we do that, all of that, by reference to multilateral standards. The key for us is to use and strengthen the global multilateral governance systems that we have in the International Labour Organization, in the Multilateral Environmental Agreement, and the climate agreements. Now, with a country like Canada, that is a developed country, a like-minded country, we are very much of the same mindset, share our objectives, both between us in the multilateral context, but also in the way in which we engage with other countries. Questions are different that we have to address between us, and I will come to that in a moment. What I want to highlight here as well is we want to look in particular also at point 3, which is, can we do things that go beyond the sustainability commitment as such? So where we want to effectively implement commitments we have under the ILO, effectively implement commitments that we have in multilateral environmental agreement. Can we go beyond these core commitments and also mobilize other elements that we have in trade agreements to support sustainability? And the look at, can we promote trade in environmental goods and services? So goods and services that have clear green credentials, and that could help making the green transition more affordable, more quick, more effective, is one example of what mainstreaming could stand for. What I also want to highlight is points 5 and 6 here. Civil society has a crucial role. Our work with Canada is standing out on that account because we have a particularly active interaction between civil society groupings on both sides and between civil society and the two governments as well, which is a model for the implementation of all our other agreements. And the novelty that is there is adding the possibility of trade remedies for key commitments, notably the fundamental rights and principles in the ILO, and major violations of commitments under the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Now, this is easy to take to new negotiations, and we have done that with New Zealand. We're doing that in what we have proposed to India, in the way in which we're updating the ongoing negotiations with Kenya, Australia, or Indonesia. But it's also very relevant for agreements that are in place, like CETA, for which we have just celebrated the 5th anniversary. Many of the things that the EU has set out as ways of taking work on sustainability in trade agreements in the implementation forward, the majority of that can be done immediately, including in existing agreements. And if I go through those 20 points we had, having an exchange of how we do our respective legislations and how we can comply with what we're creating is one of the topics that has been standard fare on our annual meetings, be it on deforestation, on carbon border adjustment measures, but also in advance of adopting legislation. Like our colleagues had significant discussions, very fruitful discussions with their Canadian counterparts on how to design legislation on forced labor. When we look at country priorities, our conversation is not about falling short of the international standards, but our conversation, like today, is more about where is the value added in our conversation between us to inspire us to create ideas so we can take the thinking and the action forward. Part of that could be this idea of mainstreaming. Is there something in the way we implement the agreement as it is that could, beyond the TSD job, to support the needs and the opportunities for bringing sustainability and supporting sustainability? In the sense of another action that is there, having a comprehensive approach, bringing all the forces together around the objectives, the goals that we share, One idea is that to see between Canada and the EU and the countries we're both engaging with, and where we have both identified gaps in compliance, how we can exchange our experiences, see what does work, what works less, and how can we mutually support each other, Canada and the EU, in engaging with our third country partners we both have trade agreements with. Now, one more question is here then for civil society. There, even though the engagement with civil society is very much advanced in the case of the Canada agreement, the CETA agreement, one new element we have introduced in recent agreements is for civil society advisors to possibly cover the entire agreement, so not just the sustainability chapter, but also on all other chapters, and connecting that with the idea of mainstreaming. There may be a lot for business, for unions, or for environmental non-governmental organizations to contribute to the conversations between the governments. So these, just to give you a couple of examples, the nature of our engagement between like-minded countries is different from the one that we have with other countries, and still the policy orientation we have created a year ago might give us some inspiration. And if I take the next slide and last slide, that's just saying that indeed we have a living agreement. In our many conversations we had over the last 5+ years, we haven't identified shortcomings, non-compliances between us. Our conversation is really about how can we take matters forward, how can we create models, experiences that we could also maybe socialize, bring to our other agreements, or maybe bring to our conversations in a multilateral context. And this is where we also had our last conversation in April 2023 to look at ideas coming from the Canadian side, but also ideas coming from this policy document that we have created as EU, as European Commission, to see how we can further develop our agreement as a living agreement, taking up the new issues of time. And I would say the conference today, the meeting today, is an opportunity to dive deeper into one of the topics. So CETA is a model of an agreement on sustainability. We work well together here in the WTO, in G7, G20, in the ILO. It's a model in the ways we engage with domestic advisory groups, and it's a wonderful platform to develop joint action plans and to identify topics like this one to dive deeper. That in some is the context, and we were looking forward very much to a good and detailed discussion that also serves to inspire us as governments further for our future exchanges and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those really helpful remarks, Ulrich. Well, this I think really sets the stage very effectively for the discussion to come. I found it really interesting how you also reinforced the idea that we already heard about this being a living agreement, and how even though the CETA text has been negotiated with the latest Trade and Sustainable Development Review, a number of elements that came out and action plans are actually immediately deployable. So I think that is something really interesting for this discussion, and also how there is an interaction between this bilateral trade agreement and some of the unilateral approaches that are being developed in the context of transitioning towards a circular economy, with again here an emphasis on cooperation. So thank you very much for that. We are now going to turn towards the other side of this partnership. We're going to focus on Canada, and it's my pleasure to introduce Nathalie Thériault, who is the Executive Director of the Strategic Policy Directorate at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and she is responsible for federal leadership on circular economy approaches at the national level. Nathalie will be speaking to how the circular economy in Canada is growing and evolving, and how Canada-EU cooperation can support advancing efforts underway. And Nathalie, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Colette. Nice to be here with you all today. Just wanted to let you know I'm coming to you from Ottawa, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And like my predecessors have said, this is a great timing, I think, for Canada to have this conversation. As you probably have seen in the news, we're in the midst of some pretty major forest fires that are happening all across the country. I myself am inside today, given that we are at the extreme end of the air quality index rating. So again, timely to have these conversations in terms of how we can advance our collective climate and environmental objectives. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada's efforts to advance a circular economy. You'll see through the presentation lots of alignment with the EU's recent and long-standing efforts, I would say. Canada, while we have some great leadership that we'll talk about today in particular areas of focus, we certainly are not at the point that the EU is at in terms of a broad kind of national strategy or framework, and that is something we're quite mindful of, and we look to the EU as a bit of an example as we do some policy thinking in that regard. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So I'd just like to start by highlighting that for Canada, federal engagement on the circular economy has evolved over a relatively short period of time. We really started in 2018 with our presidency, the G7 presidency. And at that time, the presidency launched the Oceans Plastic Charter, which was ambitious commitments to address plastic waste across the entire life cycle, which really then led Canada to create a national zero plastic waste strategy and action plan, with that being Canada's flagship circular economy initiative. And I'll speak a little bit more to that later. Also at the G7 summit, we had a coalition of NGOs, corporations, and academics that came together to launch the Circular Economy Leadership Canada, which is a group that has helped to consolidate the voice of the circular community in Canada ever since. And they are quite active on the international stage as well. So just thinking about Ulrich's comments about the role and importance of civil society engagement, and you will see that that is happening in a robust way here in Canada. So in early 2019, Canada hosted the World Circular Economy Forum. Obviously, it was we had to delay it because of the pandemic, and so we ended up having to pivot to more of an online virtual forum, but we were still able to feature 95 speakers from 27 countries and had nearly 9,000 people registered from 160 countries. And it's something that we're quite proud of. And it was the first time the World Circular Economy Forum was held in North America. And I would say it really kind of galvanized our efforts here in Canada and started to kind of mobilize players across the, at all levels of government and in civil society, and to think about what kind of lessons learned that we could apply in the Canadian context. And then in 2021, we had commissioned the Canadian Council of Academies, who set up an expert panel, and they released a report on Canada's circular economy efforts, which was the first publicly available report on the status of the circular economy in Canada. And really in that report, Canada was found to have a circularity rate of approximately 6.1%, in contrast to the EU's rate of 11.5%. So it gives you a bit of a sense of how we compare. And then just to note that the circular economy has been growing in Canada with increasing interest and engagement from across society. And in fact, in 2 weeks from now, the CLC and our Circular Innovation Council, so two of those key kind of civil society groups, will be hosting the first Canadian Circular Economy Summit in Toronto. And my team and I will be there having discussions with other levels of government in Canada to talk about how we can collectively advance the circular economy in Canada. Next slide, please. So you'll see here that the circular economy touches many of Canada's environmental and economic priorities. I'm sure you can see lots of alignment here with the EU priorities, and that's including promoting innovation, clean growth, the bioeconomy, green energy transition, addressing climate change, conserving nature, protecting fresh water, and preventing plastic pollution. Also, the new global biodiversity framework includes targets to support sustainable consumption patterns, including through having global food waste, reducing overconsumption and waste generation. My team is leading Canada's efforts in that regard for the target specifically on sustainable consumption, and we're looking to the circular economy approaches to kind of advance work in that area. And then finally, Canada's emissions reduction plan recognizes the role that the circular economy offers for sustainable economic growth while supporting net zero strategies. And this is an area that we're further exploring in terms of how the circular economy can help us advance our climate objectives. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, much of our progress is happening at the grassroots level and from a place-based perspective. So this slide shows you a large number of players active in the various sectors. So Canadian cities are advancing circular economies according to their local contexts. Several municipalities have developed circular roadmaps or strategies or adopted ambitious zero waste goals. For example, initiatives such as the Guelph Wellington Circular Opportunity Innovation Launchpad, COIL, that aim to support circular innovation and create industry synergies. And we're in the process right now of looking at options to scale up COIL to other regions across Canada. Regionally, you have circular initiatives such as the Quebec Circulaire and the Collaborative Leadership Initiative in Treaty 5 territory, as well as the Circular Great Lakes Initiative that actually crosses the border with the US. And as mentioned, we have a network of specialized and dedicated NGOs that advance research and facilitate cross-sectoral collaboration to advance the circular economy. Next slide, please. As you likely know, we're a country of shared jurisdiction with authorities set out for each level of government through the Constitution. So we've seen quite a bit of activity from a circular economy perspective at the provincial and territorial level. So at the subnational level, we have 8 provinces and territories advancing efforts to support a more circular economy, with British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia standing out as leaders. So for example, Ontario is the only province to implement circular economy specific legislation, the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. And BC has one of the most robust waste management and recycling systems in North America, including extender producer responsibility. Recycling councils are also working to advance the circular economy across the country. Recycling Council of Alberta is working with municipalities on the Circular Communities Project to create opportunities to design out waste and conserve resources. The Circular Innovation Council, which was formerly the Recycling Council of Ontario, supports policy development, research, and market programs to accelerate Canada's CE transition. And then we have Recyc Québec, which is a Crown corporation and a leader in Quebec's CE transition, working towards a Quebec without waste. So despite these efforts, and while they're laudable, the lack of alignment between the subnational efforts creates challenges for scaling up our circular economy initiatives. So for example, with different regulations and expectations for businesses between jurisdictions, this really causes confusion and disjointed efforts. And it's something that myself and my team continue to hear about. And so we're looking at opportunities to explore a more sort of coordinated strategic approach at the national level in terms of helping to set direction, address barriers, and de-risk investment, and create economies of scale. So one area in particular, if we think about extended producer responsibilities, this is where we often hear of challenges with, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, different rules apply. They apply to different ranges of materials and products. And so these are some of the areas where it's been brought to our attention that a national level approach would be meaningful. Next slide, please. So we're increasingly taking federal action on the circular economy. So we've been integrating circularity into numerous policies and initiatives in several key sectors, most notably plastics, where we are really very much a global leader, but also in areas such as electronics, food, minerals and metals, forestry, and the bioeconomy. Domestically, Canada is advancing a comprehensive agenda to reduce plastic waste and pollution and transition to a circular economy. This includes a range of complementary solutions spanning the plastics life cycle. So for example, we have our single-use plastics prohibition regulations that started to come into effect in December of 2022, banning the manufacture, import, and sale of 6 categories of single-use plastic items. And we're currently developing rules for recyclability and compostability labeling, and to establish a federal plastics registry for producers of plastic products. We're also taking action toward a more sustainable food system through the Food Policy for Canada and several innovation challenges that promote innovative food waste reduction initiatives. And then we have our Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan that lays out the potential to transform mining waste into useful products and to mine value from metal and mineral waste through scientific research and technology development. We also have the Government of Canada itself is also improving the circularity of its own operations through our Greening Government Strategy and through the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. The Greening Government Strategy takes into consideration a range of environmental impacts from procurement, including embodied emissions, water use, biodiversity, and nature-based solutions, materials, and waste. And then we in the Department of Environment and Climate Change are also developing a value retention processes roadmap and working with colleagues in our industry portfolio to implement a right to repair to extend the life of home appliances and particularly electronics. And that includes amending some of our Copyright Act legislation to allow for the repair of digital services and systems. And this was a commitment made in the federal government's recent budget, if that's something that you happen to ever peruse. Next slide, please. So I think through the presentation, you've probably seen areas where I've highlighted key priorities that would sound quite familiar with the work that's being done in the EU. And probably we've taken your lead and implemented similar initiatives here. That said, Canada's circular economy transition will be shaped by its unique context. So while I'm a very proud Canadian, I am not proud about the fact that we're one of the highest per capita consumption and waste generators in the world. There's lots of opportunity for us to improve in this area. So as I mentioned, Canada's jurisdictional complexity, large geographic area, low population density, and harsh climate result in higher coordination challenges and logistical and infrastructure costs to implementing the circular economy, especially in rural and remote areas. And if you've ever seen sort of our population distribution, we have many rural and remote areas. Despite these challenges, Canadian businesses and communities are emerging as leaders by taking advantage of circular strategies and developing innovative programs that can be adapted to suit a variety of regional and sectoral contexts. And again, just echo Ulrich's comments about the important role that civil society is playing right now in some of these important NGO groups. Canada also being a natural resource rich country, we just noted our critical supply of critical minerals for the EU as well as others globally. That's going to mean heavy mineral extraction, which will come with its own set of environmental challenges. And so we need a circular economy approach that is adapted to that reality and considers the economic, environmental, and social conditions. Next slide, please. I see, thank you, Colette. I'll move along. Just quickly, just the slide kind of lays out our international engagement. And I think Ulrich spoke to a lot of this already in terms of our G7 and G20 partnerships. We do a lot of work through through bilateral trade agreements, as well as through like the WTO, and in particular our cooperation under CETA, where you'll see we've done a lot of work with the European Chemicals Agency as an example, to help inform our efforts to improve the availability of information on chemicals in consumer products through the supply chain. Next slide, please. Again, I'm just going to end here quickly, as I think one of the earlier speakers noted some of the other cooperation that's happening under CETA that goes beyond circular economy, and this is just a bit of a flavor of that. And so I will stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Natalie, for a really interesting and comprehensive overview of circular economy initiatives that are taking place in Canada. One of the, I think, very interesting takeaways that I have from your presentation is that on the one hand, there is a need for local context and ensuring a circular economy strategy and initiatives are aligned to that local context. And on the other hand, there is also the bilateral Canada-EU collaborative mechanism, and then there is the multilateral, where the circular economy initiatives would be at a higher level and perhaps more focusing on what the common elements are between the different players in this regard that might be perhaps a little bit less attuned to local conditions or share common local conditions. So it might be interesting to pierce out, you know, as we're thinking about the circular economy and CETA, or to think a little bit about those different levels at which different kind of actions can take place and the potential perhaps tension even between local context and international cooperation and how that can be bridged. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Andrew Murphy. So we are now going back to the EU side of the story. And Andrew Murphy is a senior expert at DG Environment in the European Commission, where he works in the unit dealing with regional and bilateral cooperation. He covers strategic partnerships between countries, including between the EU and Canada, and he will be providing an overview of the EU's Circular Economy Action Plan, as well as related measures. Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. What I'd maybe do, if we go straight to the first slide, before I get going on the detail of what we're doing on circular economy, I'd like to maybe just start by giving a bit of background, given that the audience appears to be fairly mixed. So some of you may have heard some of this before, others not, but I'll maybe place our actions in context. So okay, I've been asked to start my video, but I guess you just end up looking at my face. I turned it off so that you'd concentrate on the slides, at least for this part, but I'll leave it on. The Commission basically changes every 5 years. So the current Commission that we have came in 2019. And when each Commission sets itself up, it sets a number of priorities. And so right from the beginning in this Commission, the number one priority that they set there was a thing called the European Green Deal. And this European Green Deal is not an environment strategy, it's basically a growth strategy for the EU, for shifting to a different way of doing things. And right at the heart of this European Green Deal, right from the beginning, was placed the circular economy. And you see on this slide here the different elements of the European Green Deal. And the circular economy is one of the sort of main features, one of the main focuses. But it's also worth underlining that circular economy is not simply isolated in that little circle. It's something that underpins many of the other priorities that you see there. So, for example, climate and climate change, tackling climate change, promoting clean energy, eliminating pollution. They all have an element of circular economy in them. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's it. I think it's also maybe worth saying just a few words on why we need to do this. And these slides will be made available after the discussion. So, you know, don't worry about noting things down. But basically, we just cannot continue to consume in the way that we have done so far. And the increase in the way we use materials here, we've tripled the global extraction of materials. You know, 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress is coming from the extraction of resources and their processing. I mean, just a couple of statistics here, which essentially underline the case as to why you need to move to a circular economy from an environmental point of view. Next slide, please. But as I say, the European Green Deal is a growth strategy, an economic growth strategy. And the case for circular economy is not just an environmental case. I mean, there is, you know, a very strong business case for that. We've got various studies, and you can find them on the website of the Commission. We can circulate links later if they're needed. But the studies that we do show that the circular economy has the potential to create new jobs, and new jobs in the different areas that will be coming along. The employment opportunities will be local, and it gives us the possibility to develop specialized services. And then, of course, there's the reduction in the operational costs for business, which means more profit, better competitiveness, and to a certain extent, protection from fluctuating raw material prices. And that was the case that was laid out when this commission came in 2019. And with the state of the world at the moment, the case certainly on the you've seen the fluctuating raw material prices has become even stronger. So with the two sort of COVID crisis that we've seen under this commission, there was a feeling at the beginning from some people that, you know, this would undermine the case for the European Green Deal, but in fact, as far as we are concerned, it strengthened the case for the European Green Deal. Next slide. This slide here basically explains the Circular Economy Action Plan. So under this European Green Deal, one of the early deliverables was a Circular Economy Action Plan. And this is essentially maps out 35 different actions that will help us to make this transition to a circular economy. And it basically has three focus areas. So if you look at this little circle on the left-hand side of the screen there, they are the three focused areas of the plan. So the first one is on products, second is on key value chains, and the third one is the production of less waste. If you then move across to the sort of middle column, this middle column and the colors there are linked to the colors on the left, basically lays out for each of these three focus areas, what we're going to be really looking at. So the idea on products is to make sustainable products the new norm in the EU, and really to empower consumers and public buyers to make the right choices, and to look at sustainable production processes. Then in terms of key value chains, this particular action plan, Circular Economy Action Plan, is the second one that the Commission has produced. There was one under the previous Commission. And so these key value chains either are new and were not in the previous plan, or are deepened or tackled in a slightly different way. So plastics was one of those that appeared before, but textiles, for example, is one of those areas where we're now beginning to tackle because of the impact of textiles on the environment and the unsustainable consumption patterns that have begun to develop over recent years. And then on the third, look for reducing waste, not just reducing the waste that's produced, reducing the waste that we export, and to boost the market for high quality and safe secondary raw materials. And then on the right-hand side of the slide here, what you see are basically cross-cutting concerns that we will apply to all of these three areas. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over very, very quickly the measures that we've brought in. So as I say, the Circular Economy Action Plan was 35 actions. The intention is that by the end of this commission, which is towards the end of next year, that all of these actions will be completed, and we're still on target to achieve that. But I just like with these next few slides to very briefly outline some of the measures which correspond to these actions. And I won't run through them all or read them out. You can see them yourselves, but I will highlight some of them that are perhaps more significant. So the first was a proposal back in 2020, one of the early proposals that we had for a new regulatory framework on batteries. And for those who are not familiar with the way the Commission works, basically when you come into regulations, the Commission will make a proposal. That proposal is then discussed with the European Union member states and the European Parliament. And then when there is agreement, that proposal becomes a legal act, which then enters into force. So for many of these legal proposals at the moment, the proposal has been made by the Commission and the discussions are well advanced with the member states. So I think we're well on the way to getting them on the books before this commission passes. So the regulatory framework on batteries is one that particularly we would like to flag, and also the revision of our EU waste shipment regulation, which is in 2021. So this first slide really gives some of the early deliverables. 2021 is now 2 years ago, and that was what we called the first package of measures. Next slide, please. Right, last year we had two packages that were released, what we so-called spring package, and they're the one I would really like to flag as the proposal from the Commission for a regulation on eco-design for sustainable products. And the idea of this regulation is really to place requirements on the certain goods which will be placed onto the market, place requirements on transparency of the sustainability, and also on occasions maybe some mandatory requirements on processing. This is an expansion of an existing directive, eco-design directive, which in its first form only applied to electrical white goods, basically. But it's been very, very successful in shifting consumer behavior. So it will be something that we're aiming to move or to broaden out at least. And the requirements for circularity have been increased in this proposal when compared to the original eco-design directive that's on the books at the moment. There was a public consultation earlier this year, because this will be a very gradual process. This proposal, when it's on the statute books, will be a framing proposal, and then we will move ahead with a small number of products in the first instance, and this will kind of gradually increase over time. Also, as there was an EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, which would be linked to this eco-design proposal. So those are two, like from last year, I would say. There was a second package where we revised our packaging and packaging waste directive, and that's another proposal which has attracted a lot of attention. Next slide, please. All right, and then just there, I've put down a couple of the things that are coming along this year. I won't go into any great detail at this stage because time is sort of ticking on, but I'll maybe call it a day at that point with the slides and just say a few words about how all of this stuff that we're doing on an EU level links into CETA. So in CETA, under its various committees, we find the circular economy is one of the issues that comes up on a regular basis. As Ulrich had said in his earlier presentation, we're not particularly finding ourselves in a conflictual situation. It's more of an exchange of experience. Canada and the EU basically are heading in the same direction. If you look at the plastics work, we've been collaborating on that for some time. So the goal is very similar. One of the advantages of dealing with it in the CETA context is that our counterparts normally would be Environment and Climate Change Canada, but in CETA, some of these issues are discussed in other committees, and therefore we're getting to talk to other interlocutors. So, for example, there's a Trade and Sustainable Development Committee, which is what everybody thinks of as the Environmental Committee. But we've also discussed some of these proposals in the Trading Goods Committee or the Wine and Spirits Committee, and there our interlocutors will be different parts of the administration. And I think this early sharing enables us to have a kind of detailed discussion and iron out any misunderstandings at a very early stage. Because as I say, many of these proposals are still working their way through the system, but we've been fairly close and transparent with Canada and worked with Canada on explaining what they're all about. Just to say a few words on the international side, I think my Canadian colleague has more or less said it all before me. Another example of our collaboration there is we participated in Canada's pavilion at the Climate COP last year in a seminar which looked at the role of circular economy in tackling climate change. And so that, along with the World Circular Economy Forum, again, where we were able to contribute, and we've worked very closely on G7. So a number of those things that were put up in the earlier presentation, we fully concur with, that they're good examples of how we work together with Canada on the international stage. So I think sort of to conclude at this stage, at least, I mean, obviously we can come back in the discussions later. Circular economy, as I said at the beginning, is something that is central to the European Green Deal and our own EU policy, but we've also seen in practice that circular economy has turned out to be pretty central to our collaboration with Canada in the CETA discussions and also in the discussions under the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which sits alongside the CETA agreement. So I'll stop at that point, and as I say, I'll be happy to come back in later on when if the need arises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This was also really enriching for the discussion. I think the extent to which the EU, as you've showed in the explanation of the Circular Economy Action Plan and some of the product-related initiatives, the extent to which the EU is developing circular economy initiatives at a EU-wide level is really interesting, and as also connecting this to the previous presentation, might be an interesting area for cooperation as Canada is seeking to do so and reduce some fragmentation within its approach to circularity. I think another very interesting point that you made was how different committees are discussing different elements of the circular economy. It's not just limited to trade and sustainable development, and that seems to be one way in which the mainstreaming of the trade and sustainable development provisions throughout the agreement, as was discussed earlier, could happen. So I think that is another very promising way to really have that cooperation. And of course, the transparency and the dialogue and the feedback that's being solicited in developing unilateral measures on this seems to be something with a lot of promise as well. So now we are once again going back to Canada. It's my pleasure to introduce Laurie Giraud, who is the director and owner of Giraud Environmental Consulting, located in Ottawa. She is an environmental consultant with over 24 years of experience consulting the environmental sector, and she will be presenting a brief overview of the EU-funded project Reducing Plastic Waste in Canada. And I would like to ask Laurie to keep it short because we're slightly running behind schedule. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Colette, for this nice introduction, and thanks again for inviting me to speak at this webinar today. So what I'll be speaking about is instead of trade in goods, our project had more of a focus on trade in knowledge through peer-to-peer exchanges. This was in the spirit of the shared environmental priorities between Canada and the EU. Sharing knowledge and lessons learned increases awareness of opportunities for collaboration. So I'm going to speak about this specific project, and then my colleague Barry Friesen from an organization here in Canada, he's going to speak to his involvement as a participant in numerous of our project activities. So he'll provide an overview of how the project benefited him and his organization. Next slide, please. So this was a 2-year project funded under the EU Foreign Policy Instrument. The project was conceived as a means to strengthen cooperation between the EU and Canada through a set of activities that support a transition to a more circular economy globally, in line with the direction of the EU Plastic Strategy and the EU Circular Economy Action Plan that we've heard about already today. The project was delivered by a 2-member team in Canada, so that's myself and my colleague Jacinthe Seguin. She can't be with us here today, she's away on vacation, and we were supported by European consulting companies EPRD and CEQA. So the overall objective of our project was to amplify the ongoing processes towards a circular economy for plastics in Canada by developing new partnerships, sharing European strategies, policies, and business models, and European best practices related specifically to reducing plastic waste. The project aimed to broaden the interactions between Canadian and European decision makers and influencers in public, private, and nonprofit sectors by facilitating peer-to-peer exchanges of successful policies, successful best practices to reduce plastic waste, and supporting development of knowledge regarding new technologies. So these would include business-to-business exchanges, learnings of innovative approaches to recycle plastics, and improving awareness through networking to increase opportunities for knowledge exchange between European organizations and Canadian organizations. Next slide, please. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we have the key themes of our project. So the overall theme is to support a transition to sustainable consumption and production of plastic. So the themes that we were focusing on, including looking at ways to support extended producer responsibility for plastics. So that included new upstream approaches and as well as downstream approaches. The upstream would be design elements in terms of what goes into the plastic. Downstream approaches would be advanced approaches related to collection, sorting, or recycling of plastics. Also, part of our themes included a greater emphasis on advancing the waste hierarchy. So reduce, reuse, recycle, that generic waste hierarchy, looking at ways to advance that through peer-to-peer exchanges in Canada. And examining ways to support sustainable consumption and production of plastics through generating awareness of a more circular economy and circular procurement policies and knowledge. On the right-hand side of the slide, there's sort of a quick overview of all of the different activities that were implemented during the 2 years of our project. So I'm going to be speaking about a few of these in more detail. Barry is going to speak to 3 of them that his organization was involved in. So just a few key highlights about the whole package of activities. I would say that they were all very well attended by Canadians from many sectors of the value chain. So this would include manufacturers, recyclers, industry associations, as well as Canadian government organizations, including local municipal government, federal government organizations, and nonprofit organizations, as well as environmental advocacy groups. We also found that European organizations were very willing to share information on approaches, strategies, research findings, technological advances. They were very willing to contribute, to be speakers at events, to come to Canada, to participate in conferences. So there was a high level of engagement in both directions through all of the activities. Next slide, please. So this slide is just to give a little bit of background on one of our key themes. I won't be going into all the key themes, but extended producer responsibility has been mentioned by a few of the other speakers. If you aren't familiar with it, it's an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product or a package is extended to the post-consumer stage of the life cycle. So this could be brand owner, manufacturer, retailer, distributor, or importer. In Canada, we already have a large number of EPR programs. But EPR is definitely more advanced in Europe. In European countries, they're also been considered leaders in EPR for decades now. So we've had many of our activities in the project were focused on EPR. We had our flexible packaging webinar series. We had a study tour of European technologies and met with European EPR organizations. We had a panel of speakers from Europe come to present their EPR approaches at a Canadian conference. We had one webinar that was focused 100% on EPR for agricultural plastics. We had a report on European case studies on applying EPR to the IC&I sector. So that's something that's new to Canada. Most of our EPR programs are focused on residential wastes and residential recycling. So this report looked at some of the European countries like Belgium that are applying EPR to new sectors.
Laurie, apologies. Would you kindly speed it up, because I've heard there's still quite some slides to go.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So next slide, please. So the Flexible Plastic Technologies series was a series of webinars that focused on technologies for recycling flexible plastics. This is an area that was of great interest to Canadians, because here in Canada to date, we haven't been recycling flexible plastics, but in Europe, this is something that has already been tried, tested, and is happening in many countries. So this webinar series, we had a total of 216 participants, ranging anywhere from 45 to about 100 at the different webinars. They were very well attended with 13 EU speakers, including private sector researchers, recycling companies, industry associations, consultants, and product stewardship organizations. Next slide, please. At this webinar series, we had around half of all participants were from Canada, and a large number from Europe as well, with a sprinkling of participants from other countries. And we had a good sector overview from the business, private sector, as well as industry associations, product stewardship organizations, and nonprofit groups. Next slide, please. The agriculture webinar was one that focused specifically on EPR. Barry, my colleague, is going to be speaking a little bit more about that one. It was our most well-attended webinar and included 2 speakers from Europe. So next slide, please. Our technology study tour included 8 EPR executives from Canada that went to Europe. They visited recycling facilities, advanced sorting centers, and EPR organizations. Some of the key learnings and takeaways from this study tour were that European facilities are recycling less conventional and more materials compared to Canada. EU facilities are using advanced processes and technologies compared to Canada, and participants established new contacts, expanded networks, and are continuing information exchanges. Next slide, please. Okay, our reuse symposium. This one was a little bit different. It was planned through a steering committee, including the Canada Plastic Pact, City of Toronto, recycling councils, and environmental organizations, and it was co-hosted with our colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada. So this symposium was held in Toronto. It was a full-day event with approximately 140 people attending in person and over 130 live stream participants. We had 2 EU speakers come to speak about different reuse initiatives, both at the policy level as well as at the nonprofit level from Europe. We had the EU ambassador giving opening remarks and Environment Canada's minister giving opening remarks. Following this reuse symposium, we had a half-day policy dialogue where it was more of a workshop the next day, and it focused more on addressing barriers. What could we do to address barriers? What are the lessons learned in Europe that Canada could use as a catalyst to formulate next steps?
So Larry, please wrap it up, because then we have Barry, and then we get to some questions and answers as well. Thank you.
Yep. Next slide, please. This will be the last activity I'll speak about. It was the Canada Plastics Pact workshop held in Vancouver. So it was a regional plastic pact, Canada, United States, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico, and as well as the European Plastic Pact represented by UK RAP came to Canada. This was the first regional pact that took place together. And UK RAP is considering this 3-day regional workshop as a best practice to explore opportunities to replicate working together on a regional basis going forward. Next slide, please. So I'll skip over this slide. It was about our involvement in the World Economy Forum, which my colleague Natalie spoke about already. There was an accelerator session that the project led. So next slide, please. This is circular procurement training. That was a key area of the project as well. We had 3 training sessions that we initiated using trainers from Canada and Europe to explore circular procurement elements in government organizations and how we could capitalize on further procurement training. Next slide, please. This is just a quick snapshot of the knowledge products developed by the project. They're publicly available. I'll put these websites in the chat. And next slide, please. This is the last slide. Concluding remarks. I'll just note that Canadian project collaborators in our initiative were very interested in continuing engagement on circular economy more broadly. There's a lot of appetite in Canada for knowledge exchange and sharing of best practices and continuing to learn about facilitating more circular economy from European expertise. So I will turn it over to Colette's introduction to Barry, and thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Laurie. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Barry Friesen, who is the Executive Director of Clean Farms, a national producer responsibility organization in Canada. And he'll be talking to us about reducing plastic waste in Canada. Many thanks.
Sorry, got to go off mute. Thank you very much, Colette and team for this, and Laurie for the precursor to all this. So we were very happy to be involved in this, because at the end of the road, this all involves picking materials up and making something new out of them, and that's probably one of the most important things that we do. Why don't we just move to the next slide, please? Just very briefly about Clean Farms. As mentioned, we're an industry-led extended producer responsibility organization. And we have currently 85 members. We're looking to probably double that in the next year, because we have a whole lot more programs to operate here in Canada. We have currently 6 core recycling and safe disposal programs for ag containers and plastic products. Mainly what we collect are plastics used on the farm across Canada, but we also collect chemicals for safe disposal and medications and the like. We have almost 2,000 collection sites right now across the country. And they're increasing. A little bit about agriculture in Canada. We have 190,000 farms, but that is dropping as farms get larger and more consolidation. Farms have $87 billion in operating revenue and represents about 62 million hectares, about 6.3% of the land area of Canada that is farmed. And we have done a research. Over 60,000 tons of ag waste, ag plastics generated per year. Next slide. One of the first things that we did when we got involved is we were invited on the study tour. There are 9 participants that from across Canada, mainly representing EPR organizations, and we got to go on this tour and look at various facilities. This was probably one of the most important things. It was centered around a plastics recycling conference in Amsterdam, but we went into Brussels, toured various facilities, and then came back into Amsterdam and left from there. We almost all of us knew each other before we went, because we all operate different EPR programs across the country, but this provided some really good camaraderie and learning about what's going on. It opened the doors to information sharing, new relationships. We also visited the commission that is dealing with the circular economy in Europe, and got a lot of contacts for key projects, including bottle-to-bottle recycling, which is one of the things that we're working on, and laid a lot of groundwork for various other things. And just highlight is the picture in the middle on the left at Helix. That's a sort of a world-renowned plastic twine and fishing net recycling facility that's being commissioned. And in fact, we've moved on to do more, because I just had 2 staff that came back from visiting Helix yet again, and a year later, to see how things are going and try and bring that technology here to Canada. We also have had several other opportunities. As I mentioned, we're working on bottle-to-bottle recycling program that will recycle 10-liter pesticide containers, plastic pesticide containers, into new pesticide containers. And this will be a groundbreaking thing. It closes the loop on that particular product, but also takes away the issue around hazardous waste, because now we're making a new product out of exactly the old product and filling it with the same thing. Next slide. I also chair the board of an organization that puts on an EPR conference in Canada every 2 years, and we were able to partner with this group through this partnership to bring a European panel. And this was the Canadian Conference of Stewardship. It goes over 2 days. We had about 500 business, government, and NGO leaders attend the conference, and we facilitated the panel of the EU panel of experts. And our exit surveys showed that it was the highest rated panel of all the conference. So there was a huge thirst to find out what's going on across the water, and the fact that there's a lot of trade and networking going on. Now, it really speaks well to the fact that this worked. And we also held a joint networking reception of EU and Canada project and Clean Farms to expand on our collaboration. Next slide. And then following on the heels of that, we noted that I have several sort of sister or fellow companies in Europe, IFFPG in Ireland, which does farm plastics, and Divalor in France, as well as Germany, RIGK in Germany. Very, very good ones. And we featured a webinar with Ireland and France, as well as our sister company in Brazil that also does, they actually do bottle-to-bottle recycling as well. But through this partnership, we put this webinar on. It was a fairly high-rated webinar and really showed a lot of sort of the schemes. How does the Irish team get a 90% recovery rate on bale and silage wrap? How does France get an 80 to 85% recovery on all ag plastics? And there was a lot of learnings from that. And we in Canada are learning from that as well. So this provided a great platform to be able to do it. And next slide, I think. The partnership for us was terrific, because at the end of the road, we need to find, I have truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of agricultural plastics that we collect and are pre-processed, but we have to have a place for it to go. And showcasing these things right now in our bottle-to-bottle recycling technology that we're using, where do we go for the technology? Well, we go over to Europe. We go to Italy and we go to Austria and Germany, where they manufacture these machines. And we actually took our plastic, our dirty sort of chemical contaminated plastic, and had them washed and pelletized at those facilities in those countries, and hoping to then to buy that technology and bring it over here. So this is why it's so very important. So expanding international business relationships to address, it really is a global issue, this whole plastic pollution issue. And it also introduces Canadian approaches on the global stage. We have something to offer as well. My camaraderie with my counterparts in France, Germany, and France, Germany, and Ireland, and elsewhere is really, really important. Sharing information, innovative technologies, promoting Canadian thought leadership. And I can tell you from the agriculture sector that I work in, they want sustainability. They want to prove sustainability. So overall, it's been a great process. And so thank you very much for the opportunity. I think that's it, right? Last slide. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both Laurie and Barry for explaining in some more concrete and tangible ways what EU-Canada cooperation can look like in the circular economy, as well as leadership on the Canadian front and interesting collaborative opportunities such as technology sharing, which I think in the context of a trade agreement discussion, the challenge is always to make it more granular and more concrete. And this really did a very nice job of showing the opportunities. I believe now we turn to showing a short video of success stories of EU circular economy experts to Canada. And after that, we turn to the questions and answer section. We've already received a number of questions. Those of you who have anything that you'd like to ask the speakers, feel free to use the chat box and put those in.
So Kingspan started in 1965 here in the village of Kingscourt, and is all about high performance solutions for very energy efficient buildings. About 85% of our products are insulation products and can save huge amounts of carbon and energy actually. Energy resilience is very important, energy security is very important, but also saving people money on their energy bills is very important. In 2022, all the insulation products that we sold over their lifetime will save 170 million tonnes of carbon. So circular economy is really important to us at Kingspan. We see that as a huge trend that's driving the construction industry. We're thinking about recycled materials in our products, and we're thinking about how we can do something responsibly with our products at the end of their life. Almost 40% of everything we take out of the ground every year is for the construction industry, but only about 10% of it is recycled. So there's a huge potential for impact if we in the construction industry get this right.
So in 2022, we recycled 800 million bottles like these into raw materials for products like this.
Canada is a very important market to us. There are a lot of learnings from moving into Canada and manufacturing there that certainly we've been able to take with us into other similar markets. I think the CETA agreement has brought Canada and Europe closer together from a trade point of view. Europe is a leader in terms of sustainability around the world. What CETA does is it creates a mechanism to bring that kind of technology and innovation to Canada.
Great. So I think that sets a very good scene for the question and answer section that we will now enter into. There have been some questions already asked in the chat, but I also know that one of our speakers, unfortunately, will have to leave early. So what I'm going to do is ask one question to the speaker that needs to leave early, and then we take the questions in the chat, and then we take it from there. So this question is, well, actually both for Barry and for Laurie. You know, when you're looking at activities from the Reducing Plastic Waste in Canada project, this one perhaps a bit more for Laurie, but one standout activity that could really be a thought of what would be a standout activity that could really be a catalyst or a springboard to advancing the circular economy in Canada through continued partnership with Europe, and also more specifically, and this one would be for Barry, how could we start thinking about using success stories of the projects that you've been involved in and scaling those up to other industries, to other products, to other technology issues? So perhaps Barry goes first, and then Laurie.
Okay, thank you. For me, it's all about, I'm an engineer, so I love stuff. I love gears that move, and I love plastic that gets recycled into new plastic products. And I think one of the most important things here would be, let's show that, do as much as we can, you know, annually, at least if not more, you know, how we're moving on, what is the kind of equipment that we're using. And it's a very complex, plastic is a very complex problem. It's not all about plastic here, but it's a lot of what we do is how do we go to the circular economy using post-consumer recycled content in new plastic products, and what are the things that we're doing on your side of the Atlantic and our side of the Atlantic that are working, and I think it can go both ways. A lot of the material machinery is manufactured on your side, but on our side we're using it, and we have some unique things that we're doing to make it happen. And I'll just follow up on that. Helix recycling plant, for instance, which is a groundbreaking plant that has taken the attention of, I didn't even mention that when we were there, a fellow from Tama, the world's largest supplier of twine used in agriculture, is from Israel, joined us for the tour, and because it's got the attention of everybody, and it's a flagship opportunity for us to all get together and do it. Let's focus on this equipment and the processes that work.
Thank you very much, Barry. Over to you, Laurie.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't on the study tour that Barry participated in, but the feedback that I heard was that just seeing, new approaches that are in place, it's very eye-opening for a lot of the participants. Any opportunities to continue knowledge sharing and learning of new approaches that are happening are very much of interest. And thinking more broadly from plastics, the Reuse Symposium was considered a big springboard to catalyze, lots of new thinking on the reuse space. So not just plastics, but many business models were being discussed of different materials, different ideas. This could touch on textiles. This could touch on all kinds of different avenues. So reuse, and there's a lot of new reuse business models happening in Europe. This was the first Reuse Symposium that was held in Canada. There was a lot of interest in finding out more and what kind of business models could be developed in Canada, and looking to the EU to see what might be happening next with reuse.
Great, thank you so much. Now let's turn the conversation back to some of the regulatory frameworks that were discussed in the beginning of this webinar. We've received one question in the chat from Catherine Abel, and the question is, are there any gaps in policy between the EU and Canada that you think need to be prioritized to advance circular economy and trade between Canada and the EU? And that might be a question that either Ulrich or Andrew or Natalie would be interested in answering. I see yes, I see Natalie having her hand up there.
I can start and happy for others to jump in. I mean, and I probably come at this from a somewhat biased perspective, as I am responsible for helping to advance our government's commitments related to right to repair, which also then takes into account kind of sustainable products writ large. That's sort of where our thinking is going. And so for me, I feel like that's an important gap, certainly given the fact that Canada imports many of its products. So while we may be an exporter of raw materials, we tend to import a lot of consumer products. And so the fact that the EU has its sustainable products policy and kind of regime in place, it's something I feel that we do have to consider sooner rather than later. In Canada, we also have expectations from Canadians themselves. They want to be able to access the environmental information on the products that they're buying so that they can make informed decisions. And so for me, there's an opportunity here to really share learnings about the EU's experience, given that that you're more advanced than we are in that area, and definitely an opportunity for shared learnings and further discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Natalie. I see Andrew has unmuted himself, so please, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I think I would sort of I would start by saying, the question says, where are the gaps? Well, we don't really work in CISA on the basis of any kind of gap analysis. The gaps manifest themselves, and you've just heard an explanation there of one. So really, you can look at a gap either as a gap between the EU and Canada, or a gap between both of us, where we are and where we want to be. So what tends to happen is one side or the other, hearing on what the counterpart is up to, will realize that actually, we're a bit behind here, or this is an area where we could really do more. The right to repair has just been mentioned, and in fact, this is also something where we ourselves feel that we need to make improvements, because that's one of the proposals that we've had. But as we move through the proposal to put some flesh on the bones, we'll be talking with Canada, and therefore we're both learning from each other in order to improve. So it's not necessarily so much as being able to say, there is a gap here or there, but more a question of being aware of what each side is doing, identifying where the areas of common interest are, and trying to, you can identify yourself then where you maybe fall short vis-a-vis the other, and then you can learn from them. So in terms of areas where we can work, I think, you've just heard, as I say, right to repair. I'm not so sure there's a gap, but when I was listening to my Canadian counterpart's presentation, what I realized, for example, is green public procurement is an issue where we're both working on it. And there may be some scope there for, further work on the circular economy front, which maybe hasn't taken place so far. And then I think underneath our, when I put up the slide on the circular economy action plan, there was a list of value chains there. Not all of them at this stage have been explored in the discussions under CETA or with Canada. So that there again, there would be some scope to see if that was something that was useful for the future. So I'm afraid I can't really kind of give a simple answer to that question. Where are the gaps? But I think the gaps kind of make themselves known as the discussion continues, and it really depends on the interest of one party or the other to learn on that. So if it's flagged as a priority or as an issue, then we kind of bring it into the discussion.
Colette, you're on mute.
Natalie. Ulrich, I see you would like to jump in.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it resonates very much with what Natalie and Andrew said. There's always an opportunity to look at what is it that we can do together. And the conversations like the one we have today, or those we have in the TSD committee, are one of those conversations, the opportunities where we can compare and see a bit of who is standing where and what are the next things that we have lined up. There is an environmental angle to that, but there's also a trade and economic angle to that. And we're very consciously using our trade and sustainable development conversations to update each other on what we're planning to do next, so that we can also see a bit of how to get ready to comply with what future requirements might be, how to minimize the trade effects, and ideally convert this into an opportunity of further cooperation. And the beauty of TSD committees is that you do have the environmental climate experts and the trade experts in one room, so we can look at these topics from both sides.
I'm doing it again. Yes. Thank you very much, Ulrich. I think the point about how to comply with where the regulations are going in the future as trade continues under CETA between and accelerates between Canada and the EU is a very interesting one to be explored, especially in the context of a lot of the upcoming regulatory initiatives that are happening. There is a question also here from Jenna Inch, and this question is about basically how in Canada there is shared territorial, there's shared responsibility between provincial and territorial governments and federal government, and how different regional environmental policies might complicate the cooperation under the Canada-EU the CETA with regards to the circular economy. And she is asking what could be done to potentially address that complexity. Is there any volunteers among the speakers that would like to take this question? You can just raise your hand. I see Natalie there. Yes, please go ahead.
It's probably mine to take on this one, given that this is really sort of a federal government focused question, I think, but happy for others to jump in. No, it's a very good question. And I would say this is kind of, as we think about a national approach, circular economy approach for Canada, this is probably the key issue that keeps me up a little bit, right? So we know that we've got already some really good work happening from a place-based perspective at a grassroots level. We have our provincial and territorial colleagues who are moving. And so what's the important role that the federal government can come in and play in terms of providing that kind of common approach and principles that can help guide actions that we can then scale up not only domestically, but then bring into our CETA or any international kind of conversations and participation. I think what's key is that really in our federated system, discussions with provinces and territories are key. Right? Like the federal government cannot go it alone. And we recognize that. And so we work collaboratively and we have platforms where we have discussions with provinces and territories to really try to hone in on common areas of interest. And so where is it that, you know, jurisdictions may have their own unique context and need to tailor things a certain way, but where are there sort of common areas that we can then agree on? And certainly in the plastics context, we've seen that. Lots of discussion and a whole sort of agenda, collaborative FedProv territorial agenda to advance on plastics, which then allows us to play that leadership role on the international stage. But great question.
Thank you, Natalie. Does any of the other speakers want to jump in on this as well? I see Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, I would just maybe add, I mean, certainly Canada's situation is quite complicated and quite unique. But also if you look at the EU, I mean, basically got 27 member states. So when you're trying to decide on something, the interests and the ways of working of those 27 are not the same to start with. So there has to be discussion with them from the beginning to bring them on board. That's why when we're putting in our policies together, we basically have a fairly wide consultation, not just with member states, but we also have public consultations available for stakeholders, for civil society and citizens to input into. And then actually when you've got, if it's a piece of legislation and you've got it finalized and agreed, then again, don't want to speak too much of the architecture of what we do, but you have a regulation which is directly applicable in member states. But a lot of our stuff is in the form of a directive, which then enables a member state to as long as they remain within the parameters of the directive, to implement it in a way which is best suited to their setup in the country. So this sort of, I wouldn't say our system is the same as Canada, but we certainly have a degree of sympathy for the problems that are faced in Canada, because, you know, we also have to kind of bring together the 27. And I think the key to it is sort of transparency and openness, and to involve them also in the discussions. And very often the expert groups will be made up and selected of member state experts. So, you know, it's not an us and them situation. We try to have them in from the beginning. That's just a few observations from my side.
Mm-hmm. Great. There's one question asked at the very beginning of the presentations, which concerns the role of the digital economy in advancing circular solutions, both in Canada and the EU. That might be something connected to the mainstreaming of sustainability requirements throughout the CETA. But if any of the speakers would like to say a few words on some initiatives and efforts that are happening to leverage CETA to advance digital solutions connected to the circular transition, I think that would be very eye-opening. The person who asked the question unfortunately had to leave, but she said she would be in touch with the speakers.
Now the person has left, you say, Colette, and unfortunately there's not much we can say at the current stage. You see, when you look at papers and policy orientations that the EU is putting out, the Commission is putting out, that we always talk about the twin transitions, the digital transition and the climate environmental transition. So they are both on the radar. If we bring that to our partners, we are proposing dedicated digital partnerships. We're discussing that now with partners in the Far East. There's nothing that we can say at this current stage about what that would be or what it could be in relation to Canada.
Does maybe Natalie want to take the floor on the Canadian side?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an emerging area and an opportunity to think more. I mean, I'd say one area of kind of fruitful discussion between us and our EU counterparts has been, again, in the context of kind of sustainable products and how you're communicating information to consumers, has been through a digital passport. right? So, how can we best get information in the hands of consumers to make the decisions that we want them to make, recognizing comments made earlier about the high kind of consumer demand and needing to tackle that as much as some of the production side measures or supply side measures to advance the circular economy. So that's just one example where the digital sort of era and technologies is coming into play. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a helpful example. So there's also another question that I would like for perhaps some of the speakers to answer, and this is in the context of plastic. And we've heard about some success stories about recycling, plastic waste, etc., between the EU and Canada in the context of cooperation. That seems to be, and also what we were discussing earlier, an interesting potential scalable approach. What other potential products or sectors or areas might be of interest that could be to which this basically plastic waste related project was successful? Like, would there be another area within the context of the circular economy that the speakers would consider might be basically next in terms of a priority of collaboration in this context? Laurie, please.
Sure. I mean, I would caution that we're not done with plastics yet. It's still a huge issue, and there's still a lot more work to be done. I really feel we're just getting started with plastics, especially when we think about microplastics. There's a lot more than just the plastic containers that you can see in front of you that still need a lot of work, a lot policy, program, regulation. There's a lot more effort for plastics still. But that being said, I would also suggest the next key area of work could be on textiles, because textiles is also an area that sheds microplastics into our waters, into our wastewater, which affects our environment and habitat for fish. So textiles in that front, because it contributes to the plastics in our waste, but also textiles generates waste, and fast fashion that generates waste in terms of the growing amount of here now gone tomorrow type of patterns of using textiles. Those are, I would say, the two areas of focus that should be priority in the coming years. And Natalie, I saw you nodding. Do you have something to add?
No, I definitely think those are interesting areas and something that we've certainly been chatting about. And textiles is a very interesting space, and it's sort of a growing space as well. The other one I would probably add is electronics. So I think we're seeing globally lots of focus on electronics, given the amount of e-waste as a kind of growing waste stream. And also noting that as we sort of transition to the green economy and the amount of critical minerals that we need to extract, if we can make better use of the resources that we are extracting, and that includes in electronic products, that will be key. And a big piece of that puzzle to solve, I would say, is the consumer angle, right? And some behavioral analysis that we're doing, because there are certain behaviors tied to every time that there's a new version of a smartphone that gets released. So anyway, wanted to add that in as well to Laurie's important areas of focus. Thanks.
Great. I think this is very helpful in getting some concrete ideas on how the existing framework could be and success stories could be further expanded and scaled up, and to go towards enhanced cooperation in the context of the circular economy. I would like to see if there are any final questions that anyone has that they would like to ask the panelists, or perhaps a question from a panelist to a panelist, or any pressing idea that anyone likes to share? I see no volunteers, so I take that as a sign that we're getting to the end of this webinar and we can wrap this up. So it's my privilege and challenge to provide a couple of summary points and takeaways for you, having listened to so many very rich presentations from Canada and the EU, as well as from examples in the field. And I think one of the important elements of takeaways is that the frameworks in place that enhance cooperation and provide and allow for cooperation between Canada and the EU, CETA, but also the partnership agreement that was mentioned, is really a very important foundation to ensure that Canada and the EU are engaged in very frequent and active conversations as both country, well, as the Canada as a country and the EU as a union are working towards transitioning towards the circular economy. So that's a really important platform to doing so. Another key takeaway from this webinar is how there is so much where the EU and Canada are aligned in terms of the circular transition and where they want to go. So there's, I think, a lot of there's the foundation, there are the frameworks that fosters that cooperation and dialogue. And at the same time, what also came out of this webinar is that there are also quite a few differences, notably the fact that in Canada, a lot of the initiatives are happening within the provinces and at regional levels, might make some overarching discussions a little bit more fragmented. So here, as we've heard from our Canadian colleagues, it seems that there could be an interesting area of collaboration within the context of the framework between the EU and Canada with regards to how to reflect some of these already existing initiatives in Canada into perhaps a more overarching framework. And this might be an interesting area for the EU to share its own learning experiences, also dealing with different members as they developed the Circular Economy Action Plan. So these are some interesting elements to take into account. I think what is also really interesting, which came out not as a main point, but which was mentioned by the speakers, is the fact that there are different levels at which the circular economy is being pursued, as well as particularly the circular economy and trade. There is, of course, this bilateral framework, but then there's also the unilateral approach. The Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Directive was briefly highlighted. There is also the multilateral approach that both parties are committed to, and that was highlighted. And it would be really interesting to identify how actions and activities and initiatives at those different levels could reinforce each other, and how all of these different frameworks of cooperation might be able to advance the interests of both the EU and Canada in achieving the circular economy transition. And I think finally, what was really particularly interesting was the emphasis also on concrete examples. We can talk about cooperation in the context of trade. What does that actually mean concretely? How can two partners cooperate in order to actually achieve concrete outcomes with regards to circular trade, circular transitions, circular products, circular services? And I think this webinar has showed very importantly some examples of plastics, and within the context of plastics and recycling, not yet finished, of course, but of how this can be done, how technology advancements and innovations can be shared, how through dialogue different actors across the different countries can gain from learning best practices from the other country, from other stakeholders, and also especially on the technology side. So that is also very interesting. And I think what is a interesting concrete takeaway is how can already existing success stories be scaled up to other areas. And here we had quite a few ideas that were shared with regards to textiles and electronics, and that could be some concrete entry points to take up to render the CETA an even better lever in advancing a circular transition in both Canada and the EU. So that brings me to the end here of my remarks. And before I give the floor back to Ulrich, I'd just like to finish by thanking all the speakers for really informative and excellent presentations. And for an excellent discussion. I think this was really fruitful. I learned a lot, and I hope that's the same for everyone online. I would like to thank everyone that is still with us after 2 hours of an online Zoom session, which isn't always very easy to sit in. And thank you very much also to GOPA, of course, the implementing agency of the project, supporting and promoting CETA implementation, 5-year anniversary and beyond, and the European Union's foreign policy instrument. That's the overarching umbrella that made this possible. So thank you very much, everyone. And the floor is yours, Ulrich, for some final remarks.
Thank you, Colette. And it's really hard to follow up to your wonderful summary of the conversation today. So I would start by number one, thanking GOPA, who with the help of the FBI and our colleagues in the delegation in particular have put up this seminar. Thank you for the moderation, Colette, and to the participants, Natalie, Andrew, Laurie, and Barry, for sharing with us the policy angle, but also the practical experiences. What I take away from that, in a way, you see how the conversation goes between Canada and the EU. It was a good showcase for the quality, the depths, and the meeting of minds that we do have in our discussions. It's a confirmation as an encouragement for our work forward. What I take very much with me is that question of that I couldn't answer satisfactorily today about, and where's the digital? And we all know that digital will have to play a big role. You mentioned the product passport in the reply, and there's certainly much more to that. But also the meeting of minds we saw in when we said, what next after plastics, textiles? It's you're thinking about that in Canada. We're thinking about it in the EU. I would add, it's not just waste, water. Fast fashion is also a big problem on the labor side that we wouldn't want to overlook. We have seen really dramatic examples of how that translates then in the reality of those who sit at sewing machines. Important topics that we have for sustainability writ large. With that, I would just conclude this seminar in the hope that this is just one of many more useful and good conversations we have. Based on the examples we heard, we would be also looking for input from civil society, companies, NGOs, for further examples, ideas, or suggestions they would want to make to us, either through the domestic advisory groups or broader civil society engagement that we have. That will always be inspirational. Our next meeting will be somewhere in spring next year, formal meeting, but there's no need to wait for that. You can always approach your domestic advisory groups or your government or our government, or your government in Canada, government here, commission here, if there's anything that you want to know more about what we do on TSD. So thank you very much, and wonderful event, well done, and very inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I believe this gets us to the end of our session. And a final reminder for the participants to also please take a few minutes to fill out the post-event questionnaire, the link of which is provided in the chat box. Thank you very much, everyone.